I'm sure you've been in the situation where you expressed a goal, an idea, a dream to somebody, maybe even a family member, and they'll look at you and they'll say, oh, that's impossible. You can't do that. Or for whatever reason, and of course this afflicts all of us, many of us have a negative dialogue going on in our head that tells us we're not worthy, we don't deserve, we're not good enough, we are unable to do. And the reality is, as soon as you make the statement, it is not possible, that becomes truth. Conversely, if you believe in infinite possibilities for yourself, then you're not limited.
Dr. Doty, welcome to Discover More.
Benoit, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So I want to start the conversation with a passage from your book. Manifestation is about cultivating a fierce belief and possibility. What does that mean?
Well, unfortunately, there are a couple aspects of this that we should probably make clear. All of us are manifesting all the time. Oftentimes, that manifestation is limited by our beliefs, which we don't appreciate. And many of those beliefs are a result of our childhood baggage that we carry with us, and that can be for good or for bad. But the reality is that almost all of us limit the abilities of our brain to give us unlimited possibilities. And what do I mean by that? Unfortunately, so many people give away their self-agency to others. I'm sure you've been in the situation where you expressed a goal, an idea, a dream to somebody, maybe even a family member, and they'll look at you and they'll say, oh, that's impossible. You can't do that. Or for whatever reason, and of course this afflicts all of us, many of us have a negative dialogue going on in our head that tells us we're not worthy, we don't deserve, we're not good enough, we are unable to do. And the reality is, as soon as you make the statement, it is not possible, that becomes truth. Conversely, if you believe in infinite possibilities for yourself, then you're not limited. And so the goal of the book is, number one, to dissuade people from getting lost in the woo-woo of manifestation, but also the power they have within themselves to change their future.
That's perfect. So I want to ask you about a term. What's dispositional optimism? Since that's what I sense, and how is it different from toxic, incessant positivity?
Well, you're probably more the expert on toxic positivity, although certainly I'm aware of it. Well, first of all, the world isn't always a rosy place, and taking challenges, conflicts, disappointments, anger, hostility, and somehow just saying, oh, it's okay, everything is great, the world's a beautiful place. First of all, it negates your own feelings and doesn't recognize the validity of what you're saying. Whether that's what you're saying is true or false, it's how you perceive it. So that's far different, because what it does is it only puts people into a further downward spiral. Conversely, dispositional optimism, I first heard it in relationship to a Vietnam prisoner of war. And basically, this was an individual who was a prisoner, and he had no timeline in which he was going to be released, if at all. But he chose, instead of being constantly disappointed by attaching to a timetable, he had this deep-seated belief that ultimately he would be released. And that's far different than sitting there and saying, I want this to happen, but it has to happen by this date, or I want this to happen exactly in this way. And the difference is that when you put the boundaries behind things that you cannot necessarily control, then oftentimes you're frequently disappointed. Versus if you leave it open-ended, but have this firm, fixed belief that at the end of the day, it will work out as it should work out, it's a completely different response. And it's a different response both in terms of your mental state, but even in terms of your physiology. Because as you know, Having constant disappointment or building yourself up and then be disappointed has a very, very negative impact in terms of where your head is. And obviously, it chronically activates your sympathetic nervous system or your flight, fight, or fear response versus having this deep sense of calmness. And if you want to call it equanimity, evenness of temperament, then you're not lost when things don't work out the exact way you wish them to.
An interesting resource for those who are tuning in is a book called Map of Consciousness by Dr. David Hawkins. It talks about the power of biology belief, which is exactly what you're alluding to. We can manifest, pun intended, allergies, peanut allergies, cat allergies by simply believing in it. And it's the opposite of placebo effect, which is the nocebo effect. Just to share that to drive your message home.
That's exactly right. He's written several books, and I would recommend your listeners look at all of them because he is extraordinarily insightful. But as you just pointed out, the biology of belief, you can believe yourself into a positive state where you activate all of your physiology to function at its best. Now, sometimes when you make statements like this, people get into their head that somehow by just doing that, you can overcome cancer and every horrible condition just by believing in it. What I would say is your belief is an adjunct to treatment. It is not a substitute for treatment.
And I think that begs the difference between expectations and belief. I want to jump a little bit ahead to the end of your book because I think your chapter 8 on releasing expectations and open to magic is probably the most important chapter to me. So we're talking about the power of belief, but some people might take that as, oh, now I expect a certain outcome, which is expectations. So why are expectations a thief of joy and actually hostile towards the possibilities that you're talking about?
The problem for many people is that they get attached to an outcome. And if you want to look at Buddhist philosophy or other different types of philosophy, expectation is the source of most suffering. It sets you up for unhappiness. None of us have complete control of our environments or our situations. And when you are anchored to that fixed belief, then when it does not happen, again, it activates your sympathetic nervous system. And as a species, and you alluded to our evolution, you know, if you look at how we evolved, humans have a very small litter, 1 to 2 maybe, and our offspring don't run off into the forest or the jungle and are able to take care of themselves. So the requirement is that the parents or the caregivers have to take care of them. And it's not for a few months, it's for 10, 15 years, maybe potentially even longer. And in Western society, it can go a lot longer. But the thing is, why would you do that? The amount of time and resources to care is great. And the reason you're motivated to do so is because you have a genetic imperative to do so. And what I mean by that is when you care, when you alleviate suffering, respond to a child's pain, you are rewarded. And the way in which you're rewarded is by the release of oxytocin and other neurotransmitters. As you know, oxytocin is called the love or affiliation or bonding hormone. And when that's released, our reward and pleasure centers are activated. Our brain physiology works at its best, as does our peripheral physiology. That best is actually when we engage our parasympathetic nervous system or our rest and digest system. What the problem with modern society is, which I think you know, is that unlike 100,000, 200,000 years ago, let's say on the savannah in Africa, we would see the grass shake and we would know probably that that was a predator that would activate our sympathetic nervous system, our flight, fight, or freeze response. We would have all these physiologic changes and we would hopefully escape. And then we would immediately go back down to engage our parasympathetic nervous system. The problem is in modern society, by the nature of how our society has evolved, and I would say in many ways not a good way, no longer did we grow or do we grow up in villages where we're born and die in the same village, where we have a small community who everyone knows us, they know our families, we live in intergenerational communities. It's not like that at all. In those communities, you are accepted for who you are supported, and you know whatever you think is wrong with you, you are still loved, and you deserve to be loved. In modern society, we don't live in villages. We don't often have family support at our fingertips. The nature of society demands that we work, and therefore meaning expectations that are placed on us, often ones we do not want. And as a result, our sympathetic nervous system is chronically activated to the detriment of so many of us. And this results in chronic sense of fear, anxiety, and leads to a lot of mental health issues. So it's very, very difficult for people, because the way we should live is to have a sense of calmness about us and connection to others. And not only does this improve our health, but it has a huge impact on our longevity. And you simply look at the work by Bob Buettner with the Blue Zones, or the 85-year-old Harvard study, which is called the Adult Development Study, but many people use the term the Longevity and Happiness Study that's run by Robert Waldinger.
Yeah, and the common ingredient for longevity and wellness is meaningful social relationships.
Absolutely.
And the rise of superficial relationships through social media is not equating to that, to many people's surprise. I do want to go into how we started this conversations, negative self-talk that you alluded to. So why is negativity the first language of our species, speaking of evolution?
Well, first of all, and this is why we don't have positive news media, right? Because if things are okay, you're not interested in what's going on around you. Because you have been biologically attuned to threat, because you need to survive. And so as a result, on a subconscious level, you're always looking around for threat. And I would argue that your subconscious is on 24/7, if you will. And as a result, we have negativity bias. And then as sort of an overflow from that, when we hear negative comments about ourselves, oftentimes those get embedded within us. And as a result, we're constantly telling ourselves we're not good enough or we're not worthy. And of course, because again, the nature of how we've evolved into a modern society, and I'm not sure if modern's the right word, has had a huge impact on that. If you look at some cultures, ancient cultures, and actually, frankly, third world countries, many of those people don't have any of these concerns about negative self-talk.
Yeah, and I think that's like the irony of when we prioritize GDP power and what can we see as like the progression on the surface level, we often forget the intangible and the implicit.
Well, and this is what's so sad, because unfortunately, if you look at the narrative that we have promoted, which has now been globalized, we have people from underdeveloped countries somehow believing that we offer something better for them. And they'll come to this country with a false impression that the roads are paved with gold. And they get here and they realize it is a extractive, ruthless environment, far different. And then they have the same diseases that we have. And in fact, it's horrible to watch the globalization, because you simply watch over decades what happens. And you get a dramatic increase in disease. You get obesity, a significant increase in depression, anxiety, suicide.
Yeah.
I would say, frankly, in many ways, the West offers nothing, except for many people, great unhappiness. And as we've seen, the nature of our species is that there are a lot of horribly mean people, and we have an ever-increasing income inequality that is a result of ruthless greed and extractive corporate manipulation. And this is doing no one any good except for a small set of extraordinarily wealthy individuals. And of course, these are the same individuals who run Davos. And as you well know, as soon as a person who has privilege is confronted with their privilege, they somehow suddenly feel oppressed.
You are literally the perfect person to say this because you went through I have it all to back to nothing, back to transformations, back to the work you're doing now. We won't go into too much of that since all that juicy details in your first book and also in your new book as well. But I promise that you like what Dr. Doty is saying, he is the right person to say this. And I do want to segue into my favorite passage from your book to really nail your message home. Humans are imperfect creatures, and our desires are often imperfect too. When we picture owning a Ferrari, we envision ourselves cruising down the highway at top speed, relishing the devil-may-care freedom that we believe wealth gives us. We do not imagine the pain of having no one to share adventure with. And when we picture a mansion to live in, we see a warm and vibrant scene of family life. We do not imagine our family fractured by a lack of intimacy and ourselves alone facing the cell of our home. We imagine the things we want, but not the complexities they bring.
That's true.
Yeah. And I think we could end the conversation here. But no, everything you said, I think really summarized well in that passage, but it's true. We only see the explicit, what the society value is, but we don't see all the invisible and intangible strings that are attached.
No, that's exactly right. And as you know from both my first book and this book, there's this false narrative. And we were talking about what, in some ways, society defines as success. And typically it's power, money, position. And the false narrative is that if you obtain those, that equates with happiness. And when I entered this magic shop, as a young person, 12, who grew up with an alcoholic father and a mother who was had a stroke and was an invalid, chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We were on public assistance. From that background, of course, I looked at the people who had. And these are the people who lived in nice houses and were wealthy and drove expensive cars. And it seemed to me that that was success. And of course, sadly, the people who have obtained that type of success are very proud to promote that because the reality is they have nothing else. And they believe that people admiring them or wanting to be like them will fill the void that they have in themselves. And of course, sadly, the have-nots look at these people and buy into the false Western capitalist narrative that these people are happy. And I'll explain the difference here for you. As I mentioned from my first book, this was related to meeting a woman in a magic shop who was not the owner, but the owner's mother. And she taught me a meditation practice, a mindfulness practice, if you will. She taught me self-compassion and the ability to change my internal narrative, and then to recognize that everyone is suffering, and oftentimes that the nature of their suffering actually is the driver behind their behaviors, not necessarily what's going on in that moment. And then she taught me a visualization technique or a manifestation technique. And as a 12-year-old, I had no clue. I had no self-awareness. So I made a list of the 10 things that I thought were important and would make me happy. And one was to be a doctor, which is a very honorable profession. And don't get me wrong, I was always a very good doctor and cared. But I was a doctor because I was a doctor, right? And I was recognized. The other aspect was I wanted to live in a mansion. Why? Because people would see me in the mansion. I wanted a Porsche, a silver Porsche. I wanted a Rolex watch. And I got every one of those things. It's interesting because here, at one point, I had an 8,000 square foot home overlooking the bay in Newport Beach. I had a villa on the top of a building in San Francisco. A penthouse on the top of a building in San Francisco. I had a villa in Florence. I was buying an island in New Zealand. Had a Ferrari, a Porsche, a BMW, a Range Rover, a Mercedes in the garage. I was dating starlets. I was flying on private jets. All my friends were telling me how great I was. And of course, when you chase these goals, you get to the top of the mountain and you stand there and you want all this external affirmation. What happened was I was never more unhappy than I had ever been in my life because none of those things filled that void. And I couldn't understand what had gone wrong because I had done everything the way I thought I was supposed to, and by every narrative of societal success. Yet why was I unhappy? And the problem was that I was attached to the things that define my success and did not understand that those things are transitory and frankly meaningless. And when I ended up losing $80 million or so in the dot-com crash, obviously this got my attention. And I tell people, two people became my best friends. One was my banker, because at that time, if you had publicly traded stock, you could borrow against it. So I had borrowed $15 million. And the other was my lawyer, who I had to deal with as a result of having to liquidate many things. And he had set up several charitable trusts. And so I spent a lot of time with these people. And here I was, minus $3 million in the hole. As a result, I went back to my house in Newport Beach, which actually had been sitting pretty much empty for some time. And I reflected on the situation of what happened to me. Where did I misstep? And I realized that, as I said, it was all about me. And when I went through this period of reflection, and I was discussing the situation with my lawyers because I had put a lot of my stock in a company that had not yet gone public into a charitable trust. And while, don't get me wrong, it wasn't that I wasn't interested in doing good, but primarily it was a tax write-off, right? And as we all know, wealthy people, they do tax write-offs, and you will see that they will never give anything beyond what they can get a tax write-off for. And that's just truth. Regardless, after this period of reflection, my lawyer informed me that they had actually not filed all the paperwork, and I could actually retain that stock that I had put into this charitable trust. And after this period of reflection, I decided to go ahead and still give it away to charity. And that ended up being $30 million. And what happened was I set up health clinics around the world, blood banks, programs for the disabled, programs for the handicapped, programs for adolescents affected by AIDS, HIV, because I had a sibling who died of AIDS, scholarships. I endowed chairs at various universities. What I realized through that period of reflection was that our purpose in this life is to be of service, to care for others. We talked about the blue zones and how we have a genetic imperative to care, not only within our nuclear family, but within our tribe, but frankly, within the world. And this is when clarity happened. Because when I did that, I changed how I looked at the world. And although I had some of that earlier, it really didn't hit me because I no longer was burdened about coming from poverty. I no longer carried the shame or the insecurity or the fear, because that's a driver for a lot of people who have backgrounds like my own. And frankly, for a lot of people in general, is they need to grab onto something that shows their worth. And as you well know, seeking external affirmation never solves that problem. We talk about the endless possibilities of our mind and our limited beliefs that we create for ourselves. We are the only ones who can give ourselves happiness. We are only the ones who can release the monkey on our backs. We're the only ones who can give ourselves love. And so once I changed how I saw the world, everything changed for me. And then I realized that the acquisition of things as a armor that you carry around to show the world how important you are is worthless. And this is not an anti-materialistic narrative. And because it's not that I'm against people having nice things, but it is a statement that all the nice things in the world are not going to make you whole. And they imprison you if you're not able to look at them for what they are, which is just things. And so for me, if I, and I will tell you, I live in a very nice house. I drive a Porsche. I live very well. If all of that is gone tomorrow, it's absolutely irrelevant. It was great while it lasted. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Believe me, it's wonderful to drive a Ferrari or a Porsche. But it's irrelevant. What is most important is caring for others, being of service, and looking through the lens of how can I help you? And the reason that's important is really something that not only has been verified by neuroscience, but is something that the Dalai Lama has said. If you want others to be happy, be compassionate. If you wish to be happy, be compassionate. And it's really very, very true. Again, in some ways, and if you look at this maybe in a metacognition sense, the acquisition of things or believing that stuff is important actually is a fear narrative. It's a fear narrative based out of our insecurities, our anxieties, and a belief if I can just cover myself with these things, I won't have those. Versus if you look through the lens of being of service, that, as we were talking about earlier, engagement of your parasympathetic nervous system or your rest and digest system, that is how we evolved to live. And if you were focused on that, your physiology works its best. You're much healthier. It has a huge impact on your immune system. And it affects even your telomere length. It increases your longevity. And we already mentioned the work of Bob Buettner and Robert Waldinger that validate this statement. And so if you want to manifest the best way with the highest possibility of actually having your intention manifest, you really have to be in the right mental state. And that mental state has to be the narrative of how can I be of service? Because what happens is two things. One, you realize oftentimes what you thought you wanted isn't really what you needed. And also, if you care for other people and are focused there, actually that creates the environment where you actually benefit in all sorts of ways you couldn't even possibly imagine. Because the energy you let out of yourself, and we can talk about vibration or oscillation or whatever you wish, but how you carry yourself, the energy you put out has a profound, profound effect on how the rest of the world responds to you.
Yeah, I think a quote from your book, compassion of the heart, what you want isn't always what you need, I think really drives the message home. And I resonate that with deeply because I'm in my early 30s. I've been doing this podcast for 5 years, in addition to my clinical practice as a psychotherapist. And not just in addition to normacy bias, the diminishing return of this dopamine release and fulfillment we feel from these external accolades. I think 4 years ago, I wished I could maybe get 100,000 views on YouTube a month. I've been doing that for the last 6 months. And it doesn't resonate. I don't really get excited about it. I'm looking for the million. And I realized whether it's looking for top 50 podcasts, top 10, top 1, whatever it is, like you said, if it's external, it's always going to be external outside of us. And because of this reflections and my cultivated practices, I've been meditating daily for 5 years now as well. I have turned inward and shifting my baskets of meaningfulness where I derive more for giving back, mentorship, giving back at church where I'm a deacon. Because I realized the only way to beat the race, the rat race, you can change that to corporate race, the almost famous social proof race, is to not play the game. Because right now I'm top 20 in my social science category, as you know. But then if I keep playing this game, it will never end. Even if I get number 1, I'll spend the next 20 years trying to maintain that number 1. And if I fall off of it, it'll be very detrimental. So I realized, let's go back to the genesis of why I started this, create meaningful conversations with people that I respect, I can learn from. As a process of that, be creative and be genuine in our hopes to provide value for whoever's tuning in. And I've been doing on that path for the last 6 months. And it's been very, very beneficial for my mental health. And I feel more committed to do this for 5 more years, 10 more years.
No, I think that's exactly right. In some ways, this gets back to the book. If you look at the law of attraction and the woo-woo pseudoscience narratives, as an example, the book The Secret, it's I want, I want, I want, I want. And again, it addresses what I've already talked about. You're always disappointed because you're always looking to the next thing. I'm sure you've been to a party and somebody hugs you, yet they're actually looking behind you to see who's more important. And it's very much the same way. Actually, I was on Necker Island, Richard Branson's island, a while back. And of course, the typical people who go there are extraordinarily wealthy people. I actually was giving a talk on compassion and meditation and actually psychedelics, but that's another topic we can go. But my point is, there was a young man there in his mid to late 30s, and he was telling me, I'm now worth $350 million, and my goal is to make $1 billion within 3 years. And I looked at him, I said, so what is it that is driving you to make that billion? I mean, what are you going to do with that $1 billion? He said, well, as soon as I get that, then I'm going to try to get $3 billion. And I said to him, so, okay, what do you do with $3 billion? And this horribly sad thing was all that he was going to do related to things. There was not a word, a statement, or a hint about doing things for others. Or within the same crowd were others similar to him. But the thing they were doing for others compared to what they were self-indulging in versus what they were doing for others, the others were a mere fraction of what they were doing to either enjoy themselves on a selfish level. But it wasn't like, 90% of my time I spend, at the boys club helping children or et cetera, et cetera. It was, I went on this thing to Antarctica with a group of buddies and we spent 3 weeks there and we had this expert guide. We flew in and then we had a jet come and pick us up and I'm just like, the whole existence was centered around self. Also, sadly, the degree of plastic surgery among that subset of people was astonishing. But again, it's a very self-absorbed narrative. And of course, oftentimes these people create their own tribe, right? And it's an echo chamber of that they're right and you're wrong, or how you see the world, and they just reinforce the same types of behavior, sadly. Now, I'm sure there are probably people who listening who interacted with me, and they're probably sitting there going, geez, Doty's a dickhead. But maybe I am.
It reminds me of a great book called Psychology of Money. He talks about the rookie NBA player makes about $850,000 a year, which is classified as upper class by every metrics.
Yes.
But to be a top 10 hedge fund managers in America, you make about $100 million a year, right? But then after the 100 million, there's a billion, which is 1,000 million. So going back to our point, if you're subscribing to this race, you're always going to find people who are smarter than you are, better looking than you are, more wealthy than you are, more compassionate than you are. And like I said, I think we have to define for ourselves, what is a game, this long game perspective that I subscribe to? What avenue and vehicle do you want to play that game by? Is it by the society, or is it to really find your internal fulfillment? And one more thing I want to share is you are literally the expert on altruism and compassion, right? You co-authored the book with Mathieu Ricard, French scientist turned Buddhist monk, who also the French interpreter for Dalai Lama for a long time. He also founded the Altruism and Compassion Research Center at Stanford. So I just want to add that context because we're not just talking out of your heart. We are, and you also have expertise and decades of commitment to really showcase what we're saying. But I really want to take this message home.
Again, this is not meant in any way to be a diatribe against materialism. That's the nature of the world. But that being said, you're much more happier when you understand the word enough. And that's so hard for so many people, because what happens is once they get to one level of success, it becomes a comparison with the people they hang out with. And it's always this upper, I have to beat them out. So-and-so just bought a new Tesla. I need that new Tesla, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say, listen, I was not immune to that. And I'll tell you an interesting story. With my first book, well, I was convinced to do it by a person who had attended some of my lectures, which that's an interesting story in itself. But I did the book, and of course, there was some publicity and stuff, but I really never looked at sales at all. It just was irrelevant. My statement was, if this book can help one person, that's fine. I'm happy. I have gratitude for that. Then with this second book, it seemed to resonate with a lot of people. And my publicist, who the publishing house hired, they said, "Oh, Jim, your book is now beating the, top 1,000 books on Amazon." Because, when it was first posted on Amazon, it was before it was published, it was like 400,000 or something like that. They go, "It's about to break 1,000. And then you need to check it. It's about to do this." And then I realized now I'm looking at the Amazon thing and I'm going, what is wrong with me? And again, it shows you how easily you can get into this type of comparison. And it's also amusing because I have all these people who text me or send me these notes on social media going, we can bring you up by 100x if you just paid blah, 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 blah. And, and you could say I'm the stupidest person in the world because I just don't even understand it. Yes, it would be great if my message resonated with people and people appreciated me pontificating. But that's not what I'm chasing after. Again, if my actions can benefit one person, 10 people, 1,000 people, that's great. And, this is part of the problem too, is this comparison thing. People sit there and I've heard them say, well, I've done nothing in my life. And then you look at it, you go, look, you cared for your family, you raised children, good children, they're leading productive lives. That in and of itself is a huge, huge win for you. You don't have to do anything else. And, and it's so sad because people get into this thing like, well, I should have done something where I got all this recognition. The recognition you get, first of all, it has to come from yourself, but it's not on the scale that sometimes we think it needs to be. I mean, nothing is more beautiful than if you find a partner and you raise wonderful children, or you do the best you can, and life's not perfect, but you've done the best you can. The other thing that people get lost in, they'll sit there and say, well, I'm not in a position to do anything. Well, you're in a position to simply sometimes say hello to people. Somebody saying hello, somebody taking a minute, somebody buying somebody a meal, somebody helping somebody change a tire. These types of actions, which you can do every day and which cost you nothing, can not only have a profound effect on the other person, they have a profound effect on you. And that is the life we should all try to aspire to. I mean, I think back to situations where I desperately needed or wanted something. What happens with that, of course, is as you keep trying to make it happen, you get more anxious, more afraid. The sun is obstructed by dark clouds. You say, I don't believe in God anymore. There's nobody there. Nobody loves me. And then when that person makes that effort and saves you at the last minute, it is profound, right? Suddenly the clouds part, the sun is shining, God has reached out to you, you believe in the goodness in the world. And having been in that position on more than one occasion, I certainly appreciate it. But also being able to give that gift to people is an extraordinary opportunity and is so life-affirming and so fulfilling.
Yeah, I resonate there deeply because one of my specialty is suicide prevention. As a veteran myself, and as my background is also in psychedelic science. Funny you brought that up.
We could have several conversations.
I know synchronicity is out of control, but one of the biggest contributing factors to individuals who successfully commit suicide is because no one checked in at last minute saying, hey, are you okay? Hey, are you thinking about suicide? Hey, are you thinking about taking your own life? This seemingly minute, small, tiny action could have profound impact, like you said. And like you talked about, science is clear. Gratitude is the number one contributing factor to happiness, like we talked about earlier. And one way to feel gratitude is through servant leadership. which is what I practice at church. And so I really hope that people can take away the bread and butter of this conversation, just from what we said. It's just do one nice thing a day, and that compounds to 365% of kindness that you can do every single year. On that token, I do want to going back to some of the crux and the science of your book and really keep going down this because there's so many questions I still want to ask. One of the thing we talked about earlier is the subconscious, right? We only know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. And outside of what we know is everything we don't know, right? One of the most visual metaphor that Matthew shared with me is because I asked him, how come the best people I interact with are also the most humble people? He laughed, similar to a contagious laugh, right? In his French accent. And he says, well, think about a fruit tree. Fruit trees that bear many fruits, the leaves and the branches are dangling down, like bowing down. And the fruit trees that are bearless and has no fruit are standing up high. This is the reason why humility is important. But going back to what we don't know, I learned this from your book and it blew my mind. Our brains are bombarded with between 6 to 10 million bits of information per second, while we can only cognitively process 50 bits of information, or about 0.0005% of what's coming through our consciousness. Aside from numbers, and you're like, wow, our consciousness is really nothing, huh? Like, what does it mean practically for us?
You mentioned consciousness, and there's the subconscious, and we have some access to that. Then there's the unconscious, which for most of us, we do not have access to. And this is where most of that qualia or information comes from our sensory organs. And that information is used to maintain the homeostasis of our bodily functions. That being said, though, the interesting thing about the subconscious, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is in some ways, it is always on. And as I also said, all of us are manifesting already. The reality is it's like an athlete. Athletes become elite athletes when they train. And typically, they don't do that by themselves. They do it based on working with or having knowledge of or reading about people who have great expertise and help outline a strategy for them to maximize their ability to excel at whatever athletic endeavor. And so the first thing is, one, to understand what you're manifesting already, which we've already spoken about. I mean, I'm sure you've met people in your practice who say, I don't understand it. I'm going through my third divorce and I've married this exact same person all 3 times and they're abusive and alcoholics. And you know, the problem is people are carrying this baggage forward that impacts every decision they make, every interaction they have, and every choice they make. And so first of all, you have to stop and reflect on what you're already manifesting. And again, as you know, the baggage we carry is a result of habits that we have created for good and for bad. The other thing, which we've already discussed a bit, is understanding the difference between what you think you want and what you actually need, what is best for you. And in fact, sometimes I've had people say to me, they go, well, you know, I tried to manifest this, but it didn't happen. But retrospectively, I'm glad it didn't happen because that wouldn't have been a good choice for me, right? And so on some levels, your subconscious has knowledge which you don't have about yourself. But getting back to this training, if you've never been taught how to run a race, you're not going to run the race very well. And oftentimes when we try to pick up a new habit, one of the first things we have to do, and the best way to instill a habit, is to do baby steps. Whether you want to read, Atomic Habits, or what's the other one by B.J. Fogg. But one is to start slow. And on a subconscious level, you understand then how to change your brain. There's a saying that what fires together wires together. And this is why, if you look at manifestation, that is why there's repetition. And you use all your sensory organs. We talked about, you were saying all this information comes in. Well, if we use all of our sensory organs, we think about it, we write it down, we read it silently, we read it aloud, we sit and think and have this imagery of it happening. We're engaging pretty much all of our sensory organs to embed that into our subconscious. And then that's where the magic really happens. As you are aware, there are different cognitive brain networks. One of them is our default mode network. And while we may not appreciate it, that is activated when our mind wanders or when we're daydreaming. It's very self-referential. It paints the narrative of who we see ourselves as or want to be. And then it turns that information over to what we call our salience network. It then defines what is salient, what should we put our attention focused on. And that then activates our attention network, which has sort of laser guidance to make things happen. And the salience network on the subconscious level is always on. I use the example, I think, of a bloodhound always searching for how to make something happen. And then, I'm trying to remember the phrase I used, what the subconscious desires, the conscious finds. Thank you for reminding me of my quote. And that's the way it works. And when I say the conscious, this is our executive control network, then acts as the finder or the organizer of, or makes it happen. And I'm sure you have been to a party where it's very loud. Yet, in the den of all of this, if your voice is said, you will turn to it, because that is a deeply embedded identifier of who you are. So you're always attuned to that. And I use the example, and I'm sure my example relates, let's say, to neurosurgery, where I say to somebody, well, listen, you have a benign brain tumor. It's called a meningioma. And the person will say, I have never heard of that term before. Then I'll see them 6 or 8 weeks later and go, that's the most amazing thing. I've run into 5 people with the exact same thing, right? Because they have made that salient in some ways out of anxiety and fear, okay? Also, we'll tell you another example that's happened over the last few months. I was at a coffee shop. I've been working on a fairly esoteric project. Again, complete noise, can hardly hear anything. Yet, I heard a couple of terms related to the project I'm working on by 2 individuals in the corner. I walked over, identified myself, got to know them, and now we're working together on this project. That is the peak of manifestation, right? I embedded that intention. I let my mind wander in a default node network, define it more. It then went to the salience network and defined what I needed to attend. And then not on a conscious level, on a subconscious level, was always looking around for that possibility. This is where the term synchronicity or coincidence comes from. It's from these types of things. And the most important point, though, is you can manifest even when you're stressed and anxious, which is what I did as a child. But the best way to manifest is if you've engaged your parasympathetic nervous system, where, one, these brain networks function at their best, your physiology functions at its best, and you have the right mental attitude. The other thing just to emphasize is you have to understand that you are the person who limits your beliefs and possibilities. And once you unleash that, you have unlimited possibilities. Now, this isn't to say that you say to yourself, I want to land on Mars next week. That will not happen. Okay. But if it's in the reasonable context of possibilities, even though it may seem a very, very low likelihood, that certainly can happen. And in fact, I'll give you an interesting example, which maybe shows my materialistic side. So I bought a Porsche, I think 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a used Porsche, but it was a very nice Porsche. Long story short, I ended up selling it. And I won't bore you with that part of the story. So I sold it. And from the time I sold it, I completely regretted having sold it. And I didn't even have to sell it. I just, for some reason, decided to sell it. And that's another story. But it's funny because here we are almost 4 years later. And my son, who was driving age at that time, loved that car too. And he came to me about 3 months ago. He said, you know, Dad, it's amazing. I remember the VIN number because he writes these things down. And he said, I searched it and it turns out it's for sale. And in fact, the person who ended up buying it was a Porsche collector, had it for almost 4 years, put 500 miles on it, and was selling it for less than what I sold it to him for. And so So it suddenly came back to me, and there you have it. So anything is possible, maybe even on a materialistic sense. But I put that in the context, though, of it makes me feel good. That's great. But again, it makes other people feel good. And I'm not that attached to it in the sense that, as an example, there's a young man down the street who is a nice kid. He's a high school senior. And he came to me, Dr. Doty, I love your car. He said, could you load it to me so I could go to prom? And I did. And now a normal person would sit there and say, how could you possibly loan a $140,000 car to a high school student to go to prom? And that's probably a true rational statement. But the point was for him, and this is a kid who struggled, he's had some issues. I've tried to support him, and he's overcome a great deal, and he's a super nice kid at the end of the day. And so what's the worst that can happen? I know him. He actually helps me at the house sometimes and doing stuff. And I trust him. And so I said yes. But it changed his life and how he viewed the world, right? Now, even though for him it was showing off and da-da-da-da-da, but in terms of lifting his spirits, making him feel good about himself, it was nothing. And he did perfectly fine. And again, some people may say I'm insane, but I don't have attachment to things like that. If he wrecked it, what's the worst that's going to happen? I don't believe he would because he's a good kid. But again, it's doing things that may seem nonsensical, but can have a profound effect on somebody's life. And I cannot tell you the people, I'm sure you've probably had the same experience, people who, they'll come up to you or write you a letter and they go, you may not remember me, but 10 years ago, you did X, Y, and Z. That simple act has changed my entire life. And you go, oh my God. And honestly, sometimes you don't even remember it. But it shows you how stuff you don't think may be that important, but how you carry yourself and how you interact with people has a profound effect that can carry over for years and years. And I have to say, the first book, and hopefully this book, has been so profound because I get emails or texts from people that are going, I still carry that book with me, and it's a source of solace. It's changed my life. It's changed how I look at the world, how I see people. To be able to give that gift to people and understand how so many people are yearning to be the best person they can be. And sometimes, again, they get lost in their head. They ruminate. They tell themselves they're worthless. Nobody's worthless. Everybody deserves dignity. Everybody deserves respect. And some of the greatest wisdom teachers I have, they're not college graduates. They're average people who have gained an immense amount of wisdom and insight in life. And I have the greatest respect for those types of people.
Again, I think we're tapping into the group flow. I got a email from my high school teacher I haven't connected in 12 years last week. His name is Mr. Z. I haven't even thought about that name in so long. And he sent me an email saying that, hey, Benoit, I love what you're creating. I've been following your content for about a year now. I was like, how did he even find out about the show? I don't promote this to my high school. I'm not on Facebook anymore. But I want to share one more synchronistic thing I wrote down, actually. It really blew my mind when I read your book and I recognized this connection. I just put the book down and really ponder for like 10 minutes what is going on, even though I already subscribe to synchronicity and I have had countless encounters since I started meditating. One of my favorite words that you wrote in your book is Amandine, which is a bringer of peace. That's the meaning of the name. My favorite go-to pastry restaurants in LA is called Amandine Pastry Koreatown. So think about the odds of that happening, right? Like I read your book and I've been going to this exact same named pastry shop in LA for 3 years now. And it's the exact same name because I never knew what Amandine meant. And then I never looked that up. So the fact that you had that in your book is mind-blowing to say the least. And just to do a little very brief self-disclosure, I've been going through this very, very difficult relationship rupture with my dad. As in Korean American, family is the most important pillar, since not all conditioning needs to be deconditioned, right? I like that collective mindset that my culture has. Due to just accumulative situations, family trauma, we haven't spoken in 3 years. Not a single text exchange. We never spoke. As you might know, I got married 2.5 weeks ago. So I was on a sabbatical leave.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much. So I knew I was going to see him at the wedding because through my own therapy work, I have a therapist of my own. I chose to reach out and invite him to my wedding. He left me on red. He never responded. But through my mom, I found out he was going to come to my wedding since he's dealing with a lot of shame, a lot of guilt of his own as well. And also one thing I want to say is your book is like a blueprint. It's like a step-by-step playbook and guidelines into how to practice manifestations, self-compassion, mindfulness, and just like a really good start kit to really practice what we're talking about here. So I followed I've done similar meditation myself, but I wanted to follow your blueprint for the sake of. And I started manifesting. I think I read your book about a month ago. So I started manifesting for 3-4 weeks leading up to my wedding day in anticipation of me seeing my dad. Because the tradition is we have a family dinner the night before the wedding. So I started manifesting. I started to visualize, another word for manifestation, to visualize the dinner setting. Myself, my wife now, and my parents. And I did that manifestations for about a week or 2 straight every day. Here's the good news. I don't know if he actually wore the exact same blazer I visualized him in, but my mom was wearing a dress. We were in a similar dinner setting that I visualized, and we have reconciled since. After 3 years of not talking to each other, I went through tremendous sadness and grief because I didn't get to talk to my dad. And ironically, for these 3 years, my business, my clinical practice went through exponential growth, but I felt very little fulfillment because I couldn't share it with my dad. And because of my dad, the family system also fell apart. I also got distant from my mom, my sister, and so on. Now everything's good now. So I just want to share that story because after 3 years of this rupture with my dad, now we're texting. We hugged it out. We hugged each other the night before the wedding and after the wedding. And it's like that shy Korean dad who's in his late 60. We didn't really make eye contact, but we exchanged words. And it's a tremendous progress since where we were right before 3 weeks ago. So I wanted to share that to my own testimony to manifestations, even though I already believed in it, the power of subconsciousness. But I think it's these meaningful outcome that really solidifies and attests to the reason why we have to do meaningful things. Because I really believe that to cultivate meaningful relationships, we have to partake in it meaningfully.
No, well, that's beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. And it does show the power. And it's ridiculous because retrospectively, I don't know about your particular situation, but having been in that situation, you sit there and you don't even understand how it even happened. Right? Like, how did I go from here to there? And it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you've overcome that, and now you're connected. And I'm sure that being able to do that has made you feel so good about who you are, where you're from, and appreciate the power of these types of connections. And then again, you sit there and go, how did I even though not continue this? I don't even understand it. But that's the way of life. I mean, sometimes it's not always clear, but what is beautiful is being able to overcome it and being able to move forward and have the joy of that. Because the reality is the only thing we have is time, and all the money in the world will not buy you more time. All the money in the world is not going to fill your heart. The only thing that can do that is connection to other people.
Right. And you also, of course, have your beautiful family transformations and your own journey as well, right? But speaking of beautiful journey, what is Kintsugi teaching? Since I love the concept of wabi-sabi.
Both of those are Japanese aesthetics. Kintsugi specifically refers to the repair of pottery, which this idea came around, I think, the 15th or 16th century. And previously, well, actually, they would repair pottery with these metal staples, which seems illogical. What ultimately happened was they began repairing the pottery with golden glue. Then what happened is it wasn't that they were hiding the brokenness. In some ways, they were honoring the brokenness. And this is where we get confused in our modern world because we equate brokenness with we're not worthy. And then as a result, we're terrified of sharing our brokenness. Yet it is our brokenness which makes us unique. It is our brokenness or these experiences which have taught us wisdom, knowledge, insight about ourselves, and give us the strength to move forward. And the thing is, we should honor this brokenness, thus the golden glue. You shouldn't be afraid of the struggles and adversities that you've had to face because it honors you. You've overcome these things, yet you hold it together. Even as imperfect as you think you are imperfectly perfect, and you are a whole vessel. And no one should be ashamed of anything about their background. It's always interesting to me because people who've spent a lot of time on self-reflection or trying to understand themselves or the rest of the world, that somehow we have incredible insights and we're smarter or more knowledgeable, or we should be looked at as special. And I will assure everyone, I am a frail, fragile human being who makes mistakes and continues to make mistakes. And that's just the truth of my humanity. One of the important things I think that's so hard for people is not to care what other people think. That is the hardest thing in the world. You know, I used to get all this angst when I would publicly speak years ago, to the point where, and as you would know, I mean, it shifts you from your parasympathetic nervous system to engage your sympathetic nervous system. That shuts down your executive control function, which then impacts your ability to remember things. And when you get more and more anxious, then you remember less and less, and you start doing all sorts of things to try and figure it out. And then you embarrass yourself, which is exactly what you were afraid to do, getting up in front of people. But what I realized was that I'm okay. I'm a human. And if they don't understand or accept my humanity, that I may make mistakes, it's their problem. It's not my problem. I am a worthy human being who deserves to be loved and respected and cared for. And if you don't like it, well, frankly, you. Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
It's fine.
But you are worthy of love. Every person is worthy of love. And no one gets to this life either not having something bad happen to them or making a mistake or doing something wrong or even doing stuff you're ashamed of. That is the human condition. The goal, though, is to try to live a life where you do the best you can, but understanding imperfection. And this gets back to this wabi-sabi, this, again, Japanese aesthetic, which recognizes the impermanence, the incompleteness, and the imperfection of our lives in this world. And that is reality. And so when you accept that, when you're no longer attached, this angst that we carry goes away. All of us are not going to be liked by everybody. I mean, frankly, there are people who think I'm probably a jerk, and that's okay. And, you know, if they want to talk to me about it and tell me why they think I'm a jerk, I would love to hear, because I can always improve. But my goal is to try to improve. And it's okay, too. I am not putting myself as some banner carrier of my perfection. Hopefully, what I'm doing is to say that you can be a person who is worthy, but you don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed your cuss words in your book as well. So just the right amount.
Yeah, you know, it's funny you say that, because I got an email from a woman, or a LinkedIn message from a woman, and I actually felt quite sorry for her, but I felt compelled to respond to her because she said, you know, I loved your first book and it was so powerful, and I bought the Audible and I listened to it, and it really was inspiring. It changed my life. I had my children listen to it, et cetera, et cetera. And then she says, then I got your new book and I got the Audible version. And she said, and the first sentence said, the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. And then you repeated the F word multiple times. She said, I was so appalled and shocked that I had to stop, and I haven't picked it up since. What would you think if you were driving in a car, listening to it, and there were children in the car? How would that impact them? And she went on and on about this, like, I mean, literally paragraph after paragraph. I really felt horribly sad for her. And I wrote a response that said, well, thank you for sending me this. But I said, I feel sad for you that somehow the entire point of this narrative you have put into the context of several sentences that have the, I said, she put F word. And I said, who gave you the right to judge who I am, what I'm doing? I said, what you should be concentrating on are things like genocide, and focus your energies on those who are suffering in the world and doing positive actions to alleviate that suffering. I said, if your children don't know the word, then there is a problem here because it is rampant. And frankly, I know a hell of a lot of really nice people, kind people, thoughtful people who are doing wonderful things in the world who, believe it or not, frequently use the F word. And I said, what you should be trying to teach your children is to be non-judgmental and not have some arrogant elitist attitude that your view of the world is the right view of the world. I left it at that. She did not respond.
No, I wanted to point that out because part of my ethos and my mission I'm striving for on this podcast is to highlight the nuances, but also that all of us are multidimensional because humans are complex. You talked about your compassionate, altruistic side. You talked about your materialistic side with hopefully the silver Porsche. I'm sure the Porsche was silver, right? But also the real side, the humane side of cussing. Also, the science of cussing is also pretty profound and very cool. If anyone want to nerd out on how cussing helps you alleviate our pain, that's a different story. But that's why I wanted to bring in the fact that you did cuss multiple F words and F bombs and in the book because we're humans. Just because you're respected as an academic, neurosurgeon, neuroscientist, expert of compassion does not mean that you're not going to cuss. It's part of human language. And if it's created, it serves a purpose.
Yeah, and as you know, I mean, everything has to do with context, right? I mean, you can actually say commonly used words in a manner which are highly destructive or undignified or hurtful. And that's really, I think, the most important point here. I
agree. So we're definitely coming towards the end of the conversation, Dr. Doty. But selfishly, I want to maximize your time and ask you a few more questions, and then I'll roll out the metaphorical red carpet for you to share. One thing that I think I'll love to drive our message home is changing our realities by changing the stories we tell ourselves. Going full circle, that's how we started this, negative self-talk, and our ability to limit and confine our very possibilities into nothingness based on we tell ourselves repeatedly. Because language is powerful and stories are even more powerful because we become what we tell ourselves and about the others and the world around us. So I want to get very practical for a second. How would you teach us to get real practical and grounded by improving our realities, by changing the stories we tell about ourselves and others?
Well, before I answer that question, just let me make a comment, and you've alluded to it, but words are very, very powerful, and especially for children. We may not appreciate, but when we use negative terminology or demeaning words or language around our children, they process that on a very deep level. And sometimes even one instance can live with the child for their whole lives. I gave a talk one time, and there was a nurse in the audience, and she, very accomplished, RN, PhD, runs a hospital, et cetera, and we were talking about this topic, and she raised her head, she started crying, and she said, "When I was a child, my father told me I would be nothing, and I spent the last 50 years trying to prove him wrong." Imagine the difference if her father had said to you, "You're really special. You're smart. You can do anything you want to do. I'm so proud of you." Versus this poor woman for 50 years carrying this baggage every day about her being told by her father she was going to be nothing. So words matter. They really do. But getting back to your original question, I think the most important thing is to be kind to yourself in how you talk to yourself. And think of yourself as your best self. All of us can ruminate over all the mistakes we've made and how we should have done X or Y. And in fact, sadly, most people, they don't live in the present. They live in the narrative of, I wish I could have, I might have done, or geez, next time this happens, I'm going to do. You're not living in the present. So first you have to have an image of how you want to be. What is your best self? And try to be that every day, but also don't diminish yourself because you're not supposed to be perfect. You cannot be perfect. You do the best you can. And in the face of the best you can, you still love yourself and you are worthy. And I think that's very, very important for all of us. And so I think that's really the most important step for each of us. As I mentioned about this poor woman, but I was fortunate through what this woman, Ruth in the Magic Shop, taught me, is that I don't listen to what people tell me in the sense of myself. And don't get me wrong, I mean, all of these things hurt us, but I understand where people come from, how they are reactive, how often they say things they don't mean. So I don't let that dissuade me. I would like to believe that I have a pretty strong moral compass, and that is the driver of who I am, and all the other stuff is irrelevant. I mean, the nature of the world is there are going to be people who are jealous of you. You know, one of the things that cracks me up about people who meditate, actually, because I do my thing, and I think everybody can create a meditation or mindfulness practice that works for them. And sometimes it's walking in nature. Sometimes, like the mature cards, they may have to cross their legs and do their whole thing. It doesn't matter as long as you get there. But I remember I had a person come up to me one time. They go, you know, Jim, I don't really believe you're a meditator. I just finished my third 10-day silent Vipassana retreat in the last 6 months. And I said, the very fact that you tell me that statement tells me that you learned absolutely nothing during those 30 days of silent meditation. Right? I mean, this isn't a competitive contest. You should simply carry that you have learned silently and be your best self. That's what the purpose of mindfulness and meditation is, to create the environment of calmness where your mind functions at its best and you look at the world through the lens of compassion. You don't have to tell people about it. You simply have to do it.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote by C.S. Lewis, Christian author and philosopher. He says that, it's per my Christian faith, he says that pain whispers through whisper, but God speaks through a megaphone. And I think that kind of talks about, we don't always have to wear what we do as like an armor, going back to your previous point. And it is the irony of what he's sharing with you is pretty funny. And I do want to drive, I think, all of your messages home, since self-compassion is definitely the key foundation of today's conversation. And that's something I do with all my patients as well. I want to bring back, I'm only talking about Matthew because you two are long-term friends and you guys know each other for a long time. I asked him a question on the podcast. Matthew, what's the best advice Dalai Lama told you? He laughed in his French laugh always. And then he said, self-compassion, and self-compassion. Before you do your self-compassionate meditations, do self-compassionate meditations. After your self-compassion meditation, do another self-compassion meditations. And a very practical tip might be helpful is write down on a piece of paper, draw a column in the middle, and visualize what you would tell a close friend who's coming to you with their problems. What would you tell to them? What are the words of encouragement? What are some of the soothing words you will provide for those you care about, who's coming to you for comfort? On the other side, write things down that what you would tell yourself when you're feeling down or defeated or discouraged. This is a very foundational and easy self-mindfulness exercise a lot of people know about. But just write those down, spend 5 minutes, and look at the comparison and the differences of how you yourself show up to yourself versus how you show up to others. The latest research shows that about 78% of people are kinder to other people than themselves. And what does that say about ourselves? And I just want to share that to really highlight the importance of self-compassion, and we have to accept ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugliness.
Well, and this, if you look at Carl Jung, right, the shadow self, There are parts of us that we're ashamed of, that don't reflect well on us if somebody externally looked at it, that, we may have lied, we may have cheated, we may have done something that we're profoundly ashamed of. And this can go in all sorts of different types of behaviors or addictions or whatever. The fact of the matter is, this is the same struggle everyone goes through. What happens, and you probably know this better than I, is that a lot of people have the shadow self and they try to push it away from them because they don't want to admit to it. They don't want it to be part of them. And the problem is when you push it away from you, then it's ready to jump out anytime when you're tired, when you're exhausted, when you haven't slept enough, when you're stressed, when you're anxious. And for many people, it leads them down the road of addiction because they're trying to hide away from that self. And what you have to do is you have to befriend your shadow. It doesn't mean you have to like it, but it's not going to go away. But when you befriend your shadow in the sense that you accept that that is part of you, and with all of that, you still deserve love, then you're able to not have that shadow self always be in the background and always having you try to hide it and then it waiting to sort of pop out at you. And I think that's really, really important. And if you have a background in psychedelics, I'm sure you know how that works and can be very beneficial because very few people understand that about themselves. And in some ways, what we're talking about, and I think which is hard, is this idea of sort of metacognition, being able to sit outside yourself and see yourself. Now, the nature of humanity, too, is we all create a delusion of ourself, but having even insight into the fact that you create delusions about yourself help you sit there, and this decreases oftentimes the nature of our biases by understanding that this is the case and that we're imperfect individuals. But if we always strive to see ourselves as we are and listen to people, and try to process what are the drivers. Are they trying to help me? Are they giving me a true description? Is there an ulterior motive? But from whatever those discussions or interactions are, to try to find the truth in there that can make you have insight into how you can improve yourself.
Yeah, metacognition, thinking about thinking is a superpower, right? But yeah, we're definitely coming towards the end of the conversation, Dr. Doty. Before I roll out the metaphorical red carpet, right? If I were to project your last party message on a massive messaging board, is there anything we haven't talked about today you feel compelled to share and leave the folks with?
Two things. One is each of us has the power to help another person, regardless of our position, our stature. And as we talked about earlier, sometimes it's just saying hello. And that can be so, so powerful. Do not ever underestimate your ability to improve the lives of another person. The other is a project that I've been working on, which I just want to mention, which is actually a mental health app for people who are suffering from many of the things. I call it a mental health companion. And actually, it's interesting because it uses an emotion assessment engine, a conversational AI knowledge base of compassion-focused therapy and psychology, combined with actually a human-like avatar, believe it or not. Because, they did a survey of adolescents in California, as an example, and the vast majority of them indicated they would rather talk to an avatar than a human being because of the fear and anxiety of being judged by others. And now the point of this is not to separate you from humanity. The point is to give you tools and advice that allows you to return to humanity and connect with other people. But just to mention, that app is called Happy, HAPPI.ai, HAPPI.ai. And actually, right now, people can just use it for free if they're interested. There's no cost at this point in time. So just to mention those two things.
I thought my job security with this rapid rise of AI frontier was safe, but I guess even my job as a psychotherapist is at stake. But
it's not. Well, again, I will assure you that it's not. But this is meant to be an adjunct. It's not to be a substitute. And you also have to acknowledge, one, the reality that many of the people don't want to talk to a therapist because of their own angst. Two, after 5 o'clock, most therapists aren't sitting there waiting for that phone call. They put their answering machine on that says, if this is a life-threatening emergency,
Please call, yes.
Yes. And the reality is that this actually can have a connection, if somebody chooses, with their therapist, where it summarizes the conversation and actually acts as an adjunct to therapy. So I think there are a lot of advantages. And I think, as you would probably recognize, sometimes the best therapy is simply having somebody who is non-judgmental, who is a listener, who is empathic, and compassionate. A conversation like that for 10 or 15 minutes actually dissipates many of these types of feelings. You know, this app is not meant for people who have profound psychological issues. This is meant to what we're talking about, people living in the everyday modern world.
I ditto that. And I like to say offline that judgment is a reserved domain for God. And the rest of us are just living. And I love the domain, happiness.ai. So with that being said, where can people check out your book, your website, anything else or exciting projects on the horizon?
Well, if you want to support my massive megalomaniac ego, you can find me at jamesrdotymd.com, and that has all the things that I'm doing. For the work I do at Stanford, that website is ccare, ccare.stanford.edu. For the mental health app, that's Happy with an I, HAPPI.ai. And for anybody who just wants to drop me a note, although I do get a lot of emails, but sometimes people need some support or have a question, you can send me a note at jrdoty@stanford.edu. And I do appreciate that, you know, so many people are suffering. And just the nature of living in this world can be very, very difficult. And all of you should know that you may not appreciate it, but there are people who are always there to try to help you.
Nobody walks this path of life alone. And sounds like LinkedIn might be the most conducive way to get a response from you.
Yeah, maybe. So you can find me at LinkedIn, and that's pretty easy.
All right. So that definitely concludes today's conversation. And like I said, I respect your work. Shout out to Emma Cepelo for introducing us and connecting us. But seriously, I want to echo everything you said, that mental health is real. Mental health is health. And I think if we just remove a little bit of judgments within ourselves and from others, I think the world would be a better and brighter and more beautiful place. And I think every changes start with one.
No, that's right. Actually, just to throw something out at you, reminded me of something. So there's an entity called One Humanity Foundation. And it's recently been started, and its goal is to destigmatize mental health. One Humanity Foundation. And they're actually next year, they're trying to bring together in the month of May, which, as you know, is Mental Health Awareness Month, a entity or an event that brings together 1 billion people throughout the world to support the destigmatization of mental health. So for anyone interested, I would recommend you also search One Humanity Foundation, of which, shockingly, I'm an advisor.
Yeah, I'll leave all that in the show notes. And yeah, we'll definitely love to contribute to that effort. But yeah, without further ado, to anyone and to all of you who have made it till this end, you know, attention is the most competitive commodity of 2024. Appreciate you tuning in. Hope you discover something that makes your life a little bit more meaningful day by day. Because as we know, life is a trip and life is weird and life is not always easy. I encourage you to check out everything that Dr. Doty mentioned. And as always, I encourage you to come back to next week's Train of Discover More. And I choose you to embark curiosity over fear and just be a little bit kinder to yourself and those around you every single day. Until then, see you in the next week's Train of Discover More. Thank you for tuning in.